Hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you very much to the Freedom Games and to RadicalxChange for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to be giving this keynote speech here in Łódź. My name is Claudia Chwalisz and I am the founder and CEO of DemocracyNext, which is a new research and action institute based in Paris. And to give you a little bit of an introduction of who I am before I dive into my speech, it's actually quite interesting for me to be here in Łódź because some of my family comes from here. And I was the first person who was born in and grew up in Canada. And so my own personal story is somehow shaped a little bit by the fact that, you know, my own, sorry. A little distracted by the conversations going on right in the front, if people could perhaps tie them up a little bit. So first person born in Canada from my family who comes from Poland, and it's quite interesting that actually, you know, my parents had left here in the early 1980s when it was quite a different sort of country and context going on. Skipping over a little bit, I started my university studies in politics the day that the Lehman Brothers crashed. So my whole sort of view about politics, about democracy, studying all these things was really shaped by this notion of crisis, financial crisis, then the European sovereign debt crisis, democratic crisis more broadly. My very first work was looking into populism and trying to understand the extent to which people's disillusionment with politics, with the system, with feeling like they were not really able to shape the decisions affecting their lives, were driving people towards populist parties. And through my own research and looking into the work of others, I've become very much convinced that this is one of those deeper underlying aspects of it, that it's not just going to be different policies that are decided top-down on the economy or immigration or any other topic alone, that actually gets to people's sense of not feeling like they're in control of being able to shape their lives and their communities. And this has been the sort of root then of looking into democratic innovation and what are the new and different ways in which we could be creating meaningful ways for people to be involved in shaping public decisions. And that research and set of explorations is very much what I'm continuing to be doing today and what we're doing at DemocracyNext, and is a little bit of the premise for this speech. So with that bit of context now in mind, what I want to lay out to you today is in the form of 3 questions. So the first being, what if elections were not at the heart of democracy? What if we shifted political and legislative power to everyday people? And what if we revived the ancient practice of sortition, of selecting people by lottery to form our parliaments instead of by elections? Now, 2 weeks ago, I was in Athens for a different conference, and I had the pleasure of going across the hill from the Parthenon to the Pnyx, which is the gathering place where the ancient Athenians came together to deliberate in their deliberative assemblies. And in the agora there's this ancient, quite sophisticated machine called the Kleroterion that the ancient Greeks used for selecting people by lottery. And so actually these ideas that I'm talking about are nothing new. This notion and the principles of citizen participation, representation by lot, and deliberation have a really, really long-standing history. And in fact, the idea of democracy as deliberation and democracy implying equal political rights are also nothing new and are quite widely shared in different democratic traditions around the world. And different indigenous communities, different non-Western cultures, it's also very much rooted as democracy as deliberation. As the writer Jay Griffiths wrote in her beautiful book, Wild, acknowledging that there are different ways of knowing and different ways of speaking is the very starting point of democracy. Now, of course, elections are nothing new either, but what is new is this association between democracy and elections. Because the ancient Athenians knew, if we go back to Aristotle actually, that elections lead to polarization. They lead to short-term thinking. They concentrate power in the hands of very few people. Elections are a form of constituting an oligarchy. If we think back a little bit to the French and American revolutions, which are a little bit the starting point for a lot of the modern systems that we have today of what we are calling democratic, those founders were actually intentionally designing the institutions to be oligarchic. And it's only much, much later, as suffrage started to expand, that elections came to be associated with democracy, and the term representative democracy started being used. The reference point was initially about representative government, which is not the same thing. And today we often say democracy tout court to describe the system that we have. Now, of course, I recognize that that this form of representation is an improvement on many other forms that we have when it comes to, absolute monarchs or monopolies of power by ideological or religious minorities or tyrannical dictatorships. But just because this is an improvement does not, and it's more democratic, does not actually make this an ideal form of democracy that we have today. And I really feel that in this moment, actually, of crisis that we're in, where so many people feel powerless to be shaping the decisions that are affecting their lives, and so many people are frustrated with the system and voting against it or not voting at all and disconnecting and protesting, we really need to be questioning our own assumptions. What if elections were not the heart of democracy? What if we shifted political and legislative power to everyday people? And what if we revived this practice of sortition to constitute democratic forms of governing ourselves again? Now, I invite you to imagine what this might look like. So if you want, you can close your eyes, take a deep breath. Imagine that today we are in October 2032. Yesterday, when you got home from work, you opened up your mailbox, and in there you received an invitation to be a member of your country's executive assembly. You and 30,000 other people like you have received this completely at random. If you accept this invitation, you're putting your hat in the ring to be selected in a second lottery, where there's an extra process to make sure that this final group of people in the executive assembly broadly represents the diversity of society. Yes, this could finally be your turn. Last year, your partner was a member of the Education Policy Assembly, and it was really interesting to hear their reflections about all the different discussions, deliberations that were happening, and how they were able to find consensus on so many different aspects, from exams to school meals. Your best friend was on the Judicial Selection Commission last year, which was set up to take the partisanship out of selecting judges. And a few years ago, your daughter was selected to be part of the Legislative Assembly when she was 16, and it's completely transformed her life. All of these different deliberative assemblies are selected by sortition, meaning by lottery, a new ritual that has come to be defining democracy. Just like with jury duty, everybody has access to paid time off work, childcare is provided, transportation is covered, people are paid a good salary the same way that we once paid politicians. There's access to listening to all sorts of different experts who play a really crucial role. This is not about getting rid of expertise, but it's about having the citizens who are in charge and listening to experts. And it's not just in voting and politics that this system has really changed. It's extended to other aspects of life as well, from your workplace to schools to even shaping your social circles. So last year, with new legislation that was introduced, your company has changed the way that it's governed to have part of its board selected by lot with employees who are working there. Your son's school board is now run by the teachers who take turns being selected and representing others. And your son himself was also selected to be on his school student council. They got rid of the popularity contest of elections to have this sortition-based way of governing. Now, he never would have run if it had been election-based. He was really nervous to accept, but actually it's given him a huge amount of confidence and a new set of leadership skills to have taken up his duty and his role in the student council as well. Your social circle has also really evolved. Through all these different deliberative assemblies, you've met people who are CEOs and writers and chefs and bakers and cleaners and writers. People really coming from all walks of life. People like you and me, your mom, your dad, your brothers, sisters. They are the ones who are taking turns in these different assemblies, being the ones in charge. So as you drink your morning coffee today, you think, yes, I am going to put my name in the hat for the Executive Assembly. You can open your eyes if you close your eyes. Coming back to 2022, I really do think that such a vision of another democratic future could be possible, even if perhaps achieving it within a decade might be a bit ambitious. But is it really so radical to imagine a system where everybody has equal political power? Is it so radical to imagine a new set of democratic institutions that are designed to recognize that everybody has agency and dignity, that are designed to channel our collective wisdom, and that are designed to help us find common ground on the issues that we're collectively facing in society? Now, I don't think I'm your classic revolutionary. Before founding DemocracyNext, I worked at the OECD, where I established and was leading the area of work around the future of democracy and new forms of participation. With my colleague Kyiv Tech Summit, who has also left the OECD to found DemocracyNext with me, we had established a really big evidence base of looking at 600 different citizens' assemblies around the world that have taken place at all levels of government on all sorts of different issues, and have been really showing us how it's possible to be giving everyday people the conditions to be grappling with complexity and to work together to find common ground on what do we do about the big challenges that are facing us today. We established standards of good practice as well, and we looked into the different ways of institutionalizing this. So at DemocracyNext, we're really not starting from scratch with this. We're really building on this growing deliberative wave that has already been underway for a few decades, and following a bit in the footsteps of the pioneers who have been showing us that these quite ancient practices of democracy actually work very well in a modern and contemporary context today. Examples like the Citizens' Convention on Climate in France, where 150 people were selected by lottery and tasked with coming up with propositions for how can France reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 in a spirit of social justice. They worked for 9 months and developed 149 recommendations that were put to the government. This was in 2019-2020. In Ireland, it's been a decade, actually, that at the national level, citizens' assemblies have been used to tackle all sorts of different issues, from climate change to gender equality, biodiversity, and devolution, to take some of the most recent ones. But I think some of the most inspiring examples have to do with when the Irish people tackled constitutional questions, coming up with proposals for whether Ireland should have a referendum to change the constitution on abortion and on same-sex marriage. And in both cases, a group of 100 randomly selected Irish people recommended to the government that there should be a referendum, but they also did the hard work of coming up with the proposals for how should the legislation change if people vote for change. And of course, now we know that in both cases, the Irish people did vote for change, and the new legislation that came into place was influenced by these deliberations of everyday people. And there's hundreds of other examples that deal with other issues, from infrastructure investment to 10-year, $5 billion plans to nuclear waste and nuclear reactors and all sorts of other things. And we also have permanent citizens' assemblies that are in place today. So I had the privilege back in 2018 of being part of a small group of experts that was convened in Ostbelgien, which is the German-speaking community of Belgium. The president of the parliament and the president of the government, from 2 different political parties, came together, and they wanted to establish a permanent way of having basically a second chamber working alongside them of people selected by lottery. And so we had come up with a proposition that was then put forward to the parliament and voted on unanimously across party lines. So since 2019, the Ostbelgian parliament has been working alongside a randomly selected citizens' council that has agenda-setting power, that decides what issues are put to citizens' assemblies every single year, tackling issues like the first one that came up actually was about how to improve the working conditions of healthcare workers. And this was pre-COVID. And okay, Assemblies is a very small place, and perhaps some of you haven't heard of it before. It has 80,000 people, it's a small region, but it also inspired the city of Paris. The vice mayor for participation was inspired by this example and also convened a small group of us experts to think about, okay, how could we adapt this model that was developed in Assemblies to the institutional context of the city of Paris? And so it's been since December 2021 that there's now a legal basis for a permanent citizens' assembly that has been meeting with 100 randomly selected Parisians, not just French nationals, but anyone living in Paris who can be part of this. And these are the examples that really give me a sense of hope of another democratic future being possible. They're founded in the evidence that everyday people are more than capable of being able to grapple with really complex policy issues, of listening and interrogating experts, of listening to one another, and of being able to find common ground and develop policy and legislative proposals. It's not some sort of pipe dream that's founded just on looking back to ancient Athens, but we have a lot of modern day examples of all of these practices taking place today. And I don't want this to come across as some sort of kind of politician bashing either, because I really believe that a lot of the people who are going into politics and running for office today are motivated to change their communities, change their countries, change the world, and improve things and make things better. And are often just as frustrated when they get into the systems of government by the system and by how it works as well. We need the courageous leaders, like the presidents of the parliament and government in Assemblies, like the vice mayor of Paris, who are willing to be upgrading and transforming our democratic infrastructure for another democratic future. Because I really believe that in this moment that we're in today, where so many people feel powerless and feel like they're not able to really change things around them, we need to be thinking about the new ways in which we can be evolving our democracies and building new democratic institutions that are founded on these democratic principles of citizen participation, representation by lot, and deliberation. We can be shifting political and legislative power to everyday people. We can be creating institutions that embody political equality, where people can take turns being represented and representing others. And we can revive this practice of sortition for selecting people by lot for our parliaments rather than by election. So together with a group of other democracy practitioners, academics, activists, writers, but actually quite simply citizens, we've come together to found DemocracyNext in this belief that another democratic future is possible. But I don't think we'll be able to do it alone. And so this is also a bit of an invitation to all of you to join us in this mission of shifting political power and building new institutions for the next democratic paradigm. Because I think that together we can be working to make another democratic future a reality. Thank you. And we have about 10 minutes left, because I didn't want this to also just be a one-way speech, but also a moment to be able to hear a bit from you who are here about whether, if you have any questions, whether this resonates, whether you're like, what? If you have any challenges to this premise, there is a microphone that is just over there. So if you'd like to come in, please feel free to raise your hand, and we have a little bit of time to exchange. I see 2 hands over there.
Thank you. Julian Zawistowski. So what is, of course, the most interesting in such a visionary plan is how do we get there? So, like the old problem of what is the method of agreeing on the method of the vote. So what are your thoughts there? So like this is certainly possible, but perhaps needs like the huge revolution to happen, perhaps not very peaceful, to offset the voting machine we have at the moment with all those fresh ideas.
It's a very good question. I think maybe I'll collect the 2 or 3 hands that were up, and then I'll come back to all all of them together after.
Hi, thank you. My name is Ignacy Niemczycki. I was late, so maybe you already responded to that. But I do remember when I was writing my MA dissertation, I did interviews with politicians. It was more than 10 years ago, and I remember one of the politicians that I interviewed, he told me, right, so the role of the politician is not only to listen to the people, but also to lead, to propose, even if it's controversial, to go ahead. And my fear when I hear about citizens panels and only the citizens being at the center of the discussion is that it will be stuck here. Just to give you an example, European Union or the European community wouldn't have happened after the war if it was up to the citizens. I really think so. It was really the political will and the political power of people living on the borders of different countries. So how even though I'm very open to the idea of citizens panels, there's fear that we'll just get stuck in what we are. How would you respond to that? Thank you.
Yes, very good question so far. How do we get there and what's the role of leadership? There's one more hand up over there.
Hello, my name is Marta Jagusztyn, and I try to encourage participation, not yet deliberation, in decisions about forests, public forests in Poland. And again, I was late, so maybe you have addressed this. I would very much like to hear a very specific example, like nitty-gritty details of how there was a citizens panel, there was a solution developed, and then it was actually implemented. Because I've heard of very big citizens panels that were huge events and then resulted in nothing because there was no implementation. And I find that small details and nitty-gritty is usually what's important.
Thank you. Yes, so are there any last hands up? Otherwise I will answer these questions. No. Well, three very good questions. So the first question, I'll start with them in order then. So how do we get there is obviously a question that I'm also really interested in, and this is a big part of the work that we're doing at DemocracyNext as well, because I think there's a need to have actually some sort of big picture vision of where we might be going. So that is definitely one aspect of why there's even these propositions that we're making to open up an imagination that actually we're not limited to just trying to save broken electoral politics, or otherwise our only other option is autocracy, that we can actually have the agency to be building something new. But obviously we don't have a blank page to start with. And so I think there's a lot of value in exploring what are the different ways in which parts of our system today can be changing with this aim of getting there. So how could we perhaps be changing the governance of existing institutions, so of public institutions, even like public banks or central banks, or looking into, at a more local level, how could we be completely reimagining local government with sortition-based deliberative bodies? How could we reimagine a system for taking urban and planning and design decisions with a system of citizens panels, but ones that actually have real power? And so that also entails exploring then what are the accountability mechanisms for that, and so on. Now, I don't claim to have all the answers to these questions right now, but I don't think these are unanswerable or unsolvable questions either. And I think it's part of the work and the interest now to be exploring what are the different ways in which this could actually be functioning. And there is interest from different political bodies, and we have some of the foundations in the examples that I mentioned, like in Ostbelgien and like in Paris, and actually there's things happening in Toronto and Bogota and Australia and other places too. I just shared a few examples to show. So I think it's building on those few things that we have, creating institutional legal bases. And what I'm interested in is what are the initial steps we can be taking where it's not just an advisory citizens panel that's established, but one that actually has decision-making authority. So I think that's one way of getting there, but I also recognize your point that I'm not calling for a bloody revolution, but I do think that there's a need to be engaging a wider public and getting more people, aware of, interested, and inspired by, and calling for this kind of change too, because I don't think most politicians just want to give up power and change the system like this. So there needs to be both, working with the agents of change who are within the system, and I do believe they're there, but also working with a wider public to gain momentum for this too. Now, I really appreciate the question about political leadership too, which I recognize is a thing, and I don't have the answers to that question, and I don't think that a system with sortition-based deliberative assemblies means that that's the only thing that defines that system. So just like how today we have elections and we have our parliaments, but they're often in connection to different bodies that are sometimes by appointment, sometimes more participatory processes. Now we add on the citizens' assemblies to the system that we have today. For me, the vision goes more to having a sense of these deliberative sortition-based bodies being really where the heart of power lies, but it doesn't mean it's the only thing there. And that question actually of what is the articulation between leadership and sortition-based panels is one that I'm also exploring. And again, I don't know, but I think there's potential answers to be thinking about how do we combine those two things, because I do think there is still a need for leadership as well. And then in terms of the question about the example, I did give a few examples in the talk, so maybe I'll just elaborate a tiny bit on one of the ones that I mentioned with a bit more detail, which is the example that I think has been the most powerful in Ireland about the citizens' assemblies that they had to define different constitutional issues. So actually, I mentioned abortion and same-sex marriage, but they also dealt with other constitutional issues around divorce and blasphemy. And on all four of those issues, they led to referendums, which changed the constitution, and the legislation that changed as a result of those referendums, which were all with positive votes for change. That legislation was very heavily informed by the propositions from the citizens' assemblies that came out of them. And there were also other assemblies on climate change that led to Ireland's Climate Act, and I can go into more detail about this, but actually I agree with you about the problem being that today a lot of the citizens' panels, their recommendations get ignored or watered down, or nothing happens with them completely. And that's part of the motivation for the work we're doing too, because I think we have seen actually how these citizens' panels create these amazing conditions for everyday people to be able to grapple with really complex issues and find common ground on them. And often these are issues where politicians are just stuck. And then those recommendations are going back into a system with the same set of incentives that we have around electoral politics and the short-termism of it and campaigns and lobbying and everything else. And so this approach of just adding on citizens' assemblies to a broken political system is not actually changing the system and what's not working. And I think that's why we need to be advocating for and trying to imagine and pushing for transferring real power towards citizens' assemblies rather than just being an advisory add-on to a system that's not actually changing who's taking the decisions at the end of the day and how those decisions are being taken. So I agree with the challenge, and my own motivation comes from the sense of urgency of feeling like we need to be doing something that, more fundamentally changes how we're taking collective public decisions today than just tinkering at the edges of our electoral democratic systems. So I have my little notice here that we're right up at the end of time, so we won't have another round of questions, but I appreciate the chance to answer some of those, and thanks very much for your attention, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I look forward to the other speakers. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. How does it work? Here? Which one?
Nie, ale nie do prezentacji. Nie wiem. But I think it's green. I will know. Okay, not green.
So
you have 30 minutes the time, so we can go on stage and present them.
1, 2, 3. Hello, everyone. I'm going to try and use the remote. that, oh, perfect. I figured it out. Hi, everyone. My name is Alona Shevchenko. I am the co-founder and operational lead of Ukraine DAO that I will tell you about in a bit. I would like to start from thanking the people of Poland for all the support that Poland provided to the Ukrainian people. We really, really appreciate it, and we will never be able to thank you enough for everything that Polish people have provided for us, for all the help. So that is something that I wanted to start from. And also to express gratitude to our armed forces. Yesterday we celebrated the Day of Ukraine's defenders. And they are not just defending Ukraine, our armed forces are defending the rest of the free world. And so I also wanted to start from showing the appreciation to them. I wanted to make today more than like a monologue. I wanted to be an interactive conversation. And the topic of today's conversation will be, initially it was called Technology for Democracy in Ukraine. So I was going to focus on the tech solutions that have helped Ukraine defend itself so far from the Russian invasion. And then I realized I kept iterating, and then last night I realized that a better angle would be not on how to help Ukraine continue to develop its democracy. A better angle would be to use Ukraine's knowledge and Ukraine's expertise to help other countries in the world develop their democratic institutions. And so that is something that I wanted to have a conversation with all of you about. So let's define some terms first. And so who knows about, who has ever heard of DAOs in the first place? Great, there's lots of hands. What is a DAO? How would you describe a DAO? Someone will need your help with the mic as well. There are volunteers. This is struggle for the mic there. Or with the mic. Hello.
Yeah, it's not working.
Did you turn it on?
Alona, I like what you have said, which great. Okay. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Alona, I was just going to reflect that I like your definition, which is that it's a community with a mission and a blockchain-based wallet. I think that's cuts right to the chase.
Thank you. Let's have some other options, just for variety, diversity of opinion.
It's a decentralized autonomous organization.
Right. So if you look up a DAO, if you Google it, it will tell you very different versions, and the definitions often depend on the level of ignorance of the journalist who wrote the article. Sometimes I see definitions of a DAO as an organization that does not have governance at all, not just centralized governance, no governance. And that makes me think, what is it doing then, right? And so from the very beginning, like very often people People told me in the first, especially in the first days of Ukraine DAO, they would be like, when are you going to become a real DAO? And I was like, what do you mean? And to many people, a DAO is, it needs to have a governance token, right? So the way it often works with most DAOs is that they issue a token, and that token is basically it's like your voting ballot. And the more tokens you have, the more voting power you have. Now, that can be problematic, right? If you have a social impact DAO that is focused on defense of Ukraine, and anyone can buy and sell any amount of voting power. So what would happen, right, in this case, that any bad actor would be able to hijack it. And that obviously did not look like a good idea. And we did something very drastic, and we just didn't have a governance token at all. And we still don't have it to this day. In many people, it causes this reaction. Most DAOs have a governance token. You don't, therefore, you're not a DAO. I think what some DAOs fail to address from the very beginning, what they fail to do sometimes, a very simple thing, to sit down and think, what is it that I'm actually trying to achieve? What is it that where am I going with this? What's the mission of this project, right? So there is no point having a DAO that does not contribute towards this mission that you have in mind, right? And so from the very beginning, we thought about impact and about whether it works or not, and whether it's creating that impact that we intend or not. And then if it does, then we fix things that are broken, other aspects, right? There is always other issues to solve. And so in the beginning, we had a call with Aaron from Govern and Gary from DreamDAO, and they gave us really, really good advice to not try to solve every problem at the same time, and to be solving problems that are there, that are most urgent. And that is, I think, is important to do within the framework of this conversation as well. Now, how would you define democracy? What is democracy? And I need a mic again.
The rule of the people.
Okay, how does it happen?
It can happen through voting and elections, or it can happen through deliberative processes or citizens' assemblies, like Claudia was speaking about. But in general, the principle is that some sort of power is influenced or governed or controlled by a more distributed set of people.
And that's a great answer. So there is direct democracy, where let's say there is 10 people and they all vote on every issue. And that's how decision-making works in that case. Or indirect, where you have your elected representatives, right? Which is what we have right now in most countries. Now, why do you think we have like these really long kind of election cycles, that we choose one government for some time, for 4 years or 5 years, let's say? What's the reason for that?
Shall I continue here? Well, one reason for that is that if you give a particular elected leader more time, then they can make decisions based on what they think is right instead of what they think their constituents will want them to do, which has sort of, this becomes a difficult question, but I think that's kind of the trade-off. That's how I look at that. Or, yeah, Julian.
Yeah, I think we'll start fighting for Mike, because I can give you a different perspective. So basically, democracy is a system where transition of power happens in a peaceful way. and you have check and balances that will protect the minorities from majority, from tyranny of majority. And I think that this is a way better definition of democracy, in a way that that's exactly what we have problems here in that part of the world at the moment.
So a better solution, you meant, could you clarify?
So basically, you know, like the problem with power is that power corrupts. And if we come to Claudia's ideas, this is not really important who rules you. The problem is that if you rule for too long, then you become corrupted. So what is democracy about is about changing the ruler in a peaceful way.
I'm so glad you said this, honestly. I'm so glad you said this. Watch your choice of words right now. You choose who rules you, right? That is so and there is so much in that. Today I was reading the Constitution of Ukraine, and Article 5 says that, and that is something that in Ukraine it really works. We've seen it, and we kind of take it for granted. We do not see our politicians as our ruler. It's our rulers. So the source of power in Ukraine is the people of Ukraine. So the politician is there to serve us. Our president's TV show that he had before he became president, it's called Servant of the People, right? And so it's the concept that the politician is there to represent your interests, and if he doesn't represent them, then you need to remove him. That is a core problem, I feel like, to address in many countries in the West, because we've realized that, and I personally only realized it this year, that many people they see themselves as subordinates to their politicians, and they feel helpless, and they feel like they have no agency, and they feel like their voice does not matter because they're not in power, right? So what can they change? So let's take Ukraine. A lot of people in other countries who are not Ukrainian, they really want to help. And they feel helpless watching all the atrocities, all the war crimes that Russians are committing in Ukraine, but they don't know what to do. They feel helpless, and it makes them depressed to just kind of watch this tragedy unfold. And what we try to tell them repeatedly every day is that you have agency. Your politician, if he is not representing your interests, he should not be, at a drastic level, he should not be in power. And if you feel like there is just one group of people, one group of politicians, small group of people in your country that are just making all the decisions, and people don't have a say, then it's not a democracy. People are often surprised when they hear it, but I don't know, maybe at this point I would like some feedback, like, would you agree that if the people's voices, if their interests are not represented by their government, then it's not a democracy at this time? Right? So in UkraineDAO, a couple of weeks ago, we hosted a Twitter space called something like "How to Help Germany Become a Democracy." And some people joining the space, they told us they joined because it was a provocative space, the title. And they said, obviously, it's a joke. And it was very interesting to hear, because to me, it was, it's not a joke. Because I do not see right now Germany as a democracy. And if it is a democracy, that it's actually very scary, and that's a more terrifying option, because that would imply that the inability of the German government to react properly to the full-scale Russian invasion, it means that the people in Germany are okay with it, which I hope they're not, right? So we have to deal with this, we have to address the problem of people feeling like they do not have agency, and people feeling that their politicians are their rulers. They are not your rulers. You are ruling them, and if you are not ruling them, then they need to go. And so at this point, any questions, any comments? And I'll delve into UkraineDAO, if not. All right. So let me tell you a little bit about who we are. All right. So this is one of my favorite quotes. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. We started as a Telegram group chat with 3 people on it on the 21st of February. So that would be 3 days before the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it was a product of me becoming desperate after years of trying to tell people that Russia was turning into a fascist state, which is something that I realized back in 2014 when Russia initially invaded, and I saw on the Russian news, I saw that the way they were presenting Ukrainians to the Russian audience and also to the Western audience as well was very similar to how Jewish people were portrayed in Nazi Germany media before the Holocaust. And I tried to communicate that to people like in the UK, where I was when I was in my master's, and I had an opportunity to give some talks in France, where I was in language courses, and people would laugh at this notion of Russia being fascist because they had this perception of beautiful, amazing Russian culture, and Russia being now almost a democratic country, and it's like it has some issues, but it can't be that bad, right? And at some point, I just I saw that no one is listening, and I didn't give up, but I got on with my life, right? And then in January this year, so I was never like a political activist. I was never a member of any political party at all. So it, like politics and activism and so on, it was not my type of thing. And then on the 19th of January, my friend tells me that it looks like the Russians are going to start a full-scale invasion. And what followed afterwards is weeks and weeks of myself and all other Ukrainians shouting from every rooftop about what was about to happen. And the reason why we knew exactly what Russians were going to do is because they do exactly the same thing to everyone, not just to Ukrainians, not just to people. I wanted to say people they consider inferior, but they consider pretty much everyone inferior. And so they go by the same guidebook. And when we speak to people from Estonia, when we speak to people from Poland, when we speak to people from Latvia and so on, they understand us on another level. And it's because they went through the same thing, and they suffered the same violence from Russians, and they were never... Russia was never held accountable for it. And so the reason why you see just the horrific violations of every possible human law and just horrific violence from the Russian army and very little response from the society, very little resistance to that, right, or protest to that, is because they are used to it. And so they are used to the fact that, to the perception of them nothing being their fault. lack of accountability is just not a thing in the Russian culture. And I'm sad to say this, but it's true. And so in order to stop this, and in order for nothing like this to ever happen again, what do you think will need to happen? Like, how are we going to stop genocide of Ukrainians? And that is when I want input from you guys. I need a volunteer. And silence. All right, I'll word it differently. How do we stop the war? Say again? Come on, guys. We should have some thoughts on this by now. It's like almost 8 months into this. No one wants to share any ideas. All right. Definitely not? Okay. So, the goal is to not just temporary peace, right? It's long-lasting peace. It's something that's sustainable. Otherwise, Russia will kind of consolidate, gets a bit more energy, and attack again either Ukraine or another country. And so an integral part of making sure that happens, that the long-lasting peace comes, is correctly identifying the problem. What would you say is wrong in the phrase Putin's war against Ukraine, for example? What's wrong with it? I will need a volunteer. I feel like you sir, want to tell me. Yep. Great. Would you like to get the mic? Let's talk about this.
Wrong in this statement is that it associates war with one particular person, Putin only, not with the support of the Russian society.
Why do you think they're doing that? Russians, why do they call it Putin's war? Or why does Russian propaganda media call it Putin's war? Why is it so important to identify it with him?
Because I think that by default, particular citizens that not support war itself, but and they feel ashamed. But on the other hand, they are not brave enough to clearly state it and to provide any resistance.
What empirical evidence do we have to suggest that they feel ashamed? How often do you hear Russian people speaking about being ashamed?
Well, maybe ashamed was a wrong statement. I mean, they don't fully support, but they also are either, and that's a question because I'm not so familiar with the Russian society, although I know a couple of Russians, but they are most probably a bit exception. So they are not fully able to provide any resistance, to clearly say that they are against war, of course due to the regime and due to the fact that they are simply scary of doing this in public.
Yes, that's a very good summary. And so they are not doing anything because they do not feel shame and because they do not feel accountable. They don't feel guilty. They don't feel responsible. They carried out another genocide of Ukrainians in the 30th, the Holodomor. That was a human-made famine that took lives of about as many people as did the Holocaust. and Russians were not held accountable. And so the only way to help both, to help Ukraine should be everyone's priority, just to make it clear. No one should be worrying about Russians right now, they're okay. But also to help all the people within Russian Federation that are now oppressed by Russians, to help all of them and to make the world a better place. We are going to have to hold Russians accountable for the first time in their life. And that is going to be difficult. And guess whose job is it? Who is going to do it?
Everyone.
Excellent. Everyone. And that is a complex solution, but that is the only one that will work. And that is where democracy comes in. Power of the people and the power of every individual person to make a choice. And sometimes it's going to be not at some local, I don't know, or nationwide elections, but it's going to be about how you act in a certain situation around Ukrainian people and around Russians. What kind of behavior do you tolerate? Do you allow them into your country or not? This kind of stuff. And so UkraineDAO, among other things, advocates for visa ban for Russians. And it's disappointing that we even have to discuss it 7 months into a full-on genocide. But if you visit our link tree that I'll show you in a second, you can find all the materials that you may find interesting on this subject. And so I guess my main point is that, and we are running out of time, is that it's going to be hard. The internet provides opportunities to help that were not available before, but it's going to be every individual person's job. And if you ever need if you ever have any questions about how justice for Ukrainians can be achieved, come into our Discord, follow us on Twitter, ask questions, and we are always there to help you educate yourself, and we are very grateful for all the genuine support. Yeah, I guess, God, we didn't go through everything I was planning to, but please feel free to reach out and feel free to follow us on social media. We have also just hosted Kyiv Tech Summit, which was a combination of online and offline events. Part of it was part of it was a hackathon hosted in a bomb shelter. Vitalik Buterin, Ethereum's co-founder, came to visit Ukraine for the first time, and it was a very unique experience for us that we are planning to repeat next year, hopefully after the victory already. So, do we have time for questions or not? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person, and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it, and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Atlas Network is, as the name suggests, a network, and it's global. We work all around the world. We're based in the US. We have about 159 partners in the United States right now, and the bulk of our partners are outside, nearly 500 in total.
Atlas Network, it connects people from all over the world, defending the idea of human dignity, defending human rights and personal liberties.
Atlas Network is focusing on, I think, the most important and moral cause in the entire world.
We partner with local innovators, local leaders who understand conditions on the ground in communities facing real challenges. We look at the people from the worldwide freedom movement that are passionate, are ready to make a difference, understand local conditions, and we invest in them.
At Atlas Network, we unleash individual ingenuity to enrich humanity.
The United States does not have a lock on the idea of freedom and liberty. Those ideas are beyond borders.
One of the main goals of Atlas Network is to eradicate poverty around the world, and we do that by investing millions of dollars in our partners' work every year.
Historically, wealthy nations around the world have tried to help low-income countries develop. The way we've been doing it traditionally has not really been working. So there's a movement to do development differently, and that means we need to step back as outsiders and rethink the role that we're playing in helping people in low-income countries achieve their dreams.
We want to make the world a better place. We want to make the world a freer world.
All of us want to leave a legacy and be part of something big to make a better world. This is exactly the work of Atlas Network.
With our growing number of hundreds of successful partners, we're stronger than ever.
Changing the world.
Changing the world.
Changing the world
starts together
with us.